US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He thanked them for not just the government support, but American support. Of course, he's referring to Americans as in the public. A lot of Israelis have dual nationality, dual Israeli-American nationality, and even some of those held captive in Gaza are American citizens. Of course, there's more than 100 of those that are held captive, including civilians. We did hear earlier from the National Security Council leader of Israel saying that there are no plans for negotiations with Hamas to bring back those citizens. As that was happening, we were also seeing protests by family members of those that are still considered missing, calling on their government, calling on officials, calling on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to give them more information as to the whereabouts, what the next plan is, because obviously every day that goes by, the risk of their family members that are in Gaza still held captive, there's a higher risk of them dying in those bombardments, in those continuous airstrikes by their own country, by their own government, Israel. So you can see we're now starting to see a lot more and hear a lot more from the Israeli public as to what the government response is moving forward.
Thank you so much for that update. Sarah Hayrat in occupied East Jerusalem. The Israeli army is massing troops and equipment at the border with Gaza ahead of its expected ground invasion of the Strip. Charles Stratford is in Yehini in southern Israel and filed this report.
Israel is preparing to invade Gaza. A week after suffering its worst attack by Palestinian fighters in living memory, the Israeli army is massing heavy weaponry and thousands of troops on the Gaza border. Artillery batteries have been pounding the densely populated Palestinian territory. Airstrikes have completely destroyed entire neighborhoods in Gaza, killing more than 2,000 Palestinians. Hamas fighters continue to fire rockets into Israel. Most are intercepted by Israel's air defense system, known as the Iron Dome. More than 300,000 Israeli army reservists have been mobilized ahead of a possible operation, and morale seems high.
We will win. We will win, we will liberate.
Israel's leader says this is just the start.
We are striking at our enemy with unprecedented might. I emphasize, this is just the beginning. Our enemies have only begun paying the price, and I won't detail what is yet to come, but I tell you that this is only the beginning.
This is just a small proportion of a vast Israeli military build-up north of Gaza. Much of the military equipment that we've seen gathering in this area has now moved on to what we suspect could be a more forward operating position in a closed military zone. Since Hamas's surprise military operation against Israel on October the 7th, the Israeli army has struggled to stop more Palestinian gunmen infiltrating from the Gaza Strip. The Israeli military says soldiers went into Gaza on Friday night and retrieved the bodies of several Israelis, believed to be among the estimated 150 people taken captive. Their relatives are demanding the army do more to find out where Hamas is holding other men, women and children, to prevent them getting caught in crossfire when an expected ground invasion starts. Charles Stratford, Aljazeera, Yehini, southern Israel.
After a week of fighting, there is continued fire from Gaza towards Israel. Stephanie Decker spent the day close to the border with Gaza in southern Israel.
Just as we were driving into Ashkelon, rocket barrage, sirens sounding. This has been the situation here for the last week. A lot of interceptions today, a lot of... Oh my God. More rockets, constantly.
It's a bit to the south, but
constantly now in Ashkelon being fired from Gaza. It's been intercepted by the Iron Dome. Yeah, you can hear the interception.
They've closed this entire area. There's some security incident
of whatever. It's unclear what's happening, but they're making us go around.
We didn't know at the time who was in this convoy. We were very close to the border with Gaza. And later, it became clear it was the Prime Minister himself, Benjamin Netanyahu, visiting soldiers and telling them the next stage is coming. We've just stopped on the side of the road as we saw a massive airstrike just hit the north of the Gaza Strip. This is right, the very north end of the border with Israel. Stephanie Decker, Aljazeera, on the outskirts of Gaza.
Let's head to southern Lebanon now, where there are reports of exchanges of fire across the border with Israel. Ali Hashem is braving some weather conditions there, some wet weather. What more can you tell us about these attacks, though, Ali? Are there fears of an escalation?
Well, over the past few hours, there were a lot of developments on the borders between Lebanon and Israel. The 120 kilometers border have been witnessing a lot of attacks today or yesterday. Hezbollah launched an attack on Israeli positions in the what Lebanon regards as occupied Shebaa farms, and Israel retaliated by bombarding the areas surrounding Shebaa and Kfar, killing 2 civilians. Also, Hezbollah announced that one of its fighters was killed today. Besides, we've heard also of a couple of rockets launched from Syria towards Israel, and a drone that was intercepted that infiltrated from Lebanon. So the situation is escalating day after day, and tension is threatening that Lebanon could be part of this conflict.
Ali, we know the Iranian foreign minister was in Lebanon. He's now here in Qatar. What have you learned about this particular visit?
Well, the foreign minister of Iran is efforting right now, as he said, to try reach a kind of a diplomatic deal over whatever is over the conflict in Gaza. In Lebanon, he met with Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, also with Lebanese officials. But of course, one of the main reveals of his visit, his message through the United Nations representative in Lebanon to Israel that Iran wants a peaceful ending to this conflict. However, if Israel will continue this attack, then there's going to be a different situation. Now, with him being in Qatar and with Qatar playing the role of a mediator, so there is messaging going on, especially between Iran and the United States of America. Also, it was significant seeing Hussein Amir Abdullahian meeting with Hamas Politburo chief Ismail Haniyeh in Doha, showing support to Hamas in Qatar and showing support to Hezbollah in Lebanon.
OK, thank you very much for that update, Ali Hashem in southern Lebanon for us. Before the war, Gaza was described as the world's largest open-air prison. It's been under a land, air and sea blockade by Israel for 16 years. Most of the people being bombed and forced from their homes are Palestinian refugees. Gaza was part of historic Palestine. That was before more than 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homeland when the State of Israel was created in 1948. Palestinians refer to that as the Nakba, or catastrophe. 60% of them came to Gaza as refugees. For 75 years, Israel has denied their right of return in breach of international law. Today, about 1.7 million refugees are living in the Gaza Strip. They're mostly in these 8 camps that are recognised by the UN. They are among the most densely populated areas in the world. And now more than 200,000 Palestinian refugees are living in some of the largest and most crowded refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. They're among the 1.1 million people being told to go south. Let's bring in Amr Zar, who is a professor of law and an activist. He joins us from Orlando in Florida. Thanks so much for bringing on the program, Amr. As a Palestinian American, how are you comprehending what's happening in Gaza and Washington's response?
Well, unfortunately, what Israel is doing to us is nothing new. You might see Palestinians and Arabs expressing all kinds of emotions, devastation, pain. But we are not shocked. This is what Israel's been doing to us for 75 years. It has been committing genocide and apartheid on us continuously for 75 years, trying to get rid of us. And perhaps even just as disgustingly, the United States government has been supporting them all that time, including our current president, Joe Biden, who has basically given them a blank check to perform genocide on us. They said he's not going to urge restraint on the Israelis. They said that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself. That's a blank check to flatten residential buildings and to kill people, massacre people while they're trying to escape. I mean, we are at the lowest levels of depravity and international war crimes here when it comes to Israel, all supported joyfully by the president and, of course, many in the Congress as well. So it's really disgusting to see what the United States is doing, but we're not surprised.
Do you think support for Israel is waning, though, as the death toll in Gaza continues to rise? We have seen protests across the US with thousands of people rallying in support of Palestinians.
Well, let me say, I believe very strongly in the American people understanding what's going on in Palestine. I'm simply talking about the depravity of the political leaders. But yes, we see people on the streets fighting for justice and talking about justice and trying to tell the world that history didn't start last Saturday. They're trying to tell the world that there's a whole context to this thing. They're trying to highlight the lies that Israel has told so far about Palestinians in this thing. You know, Israel and Zionism has this habit of using myths. And of course they have to, because if they tell the truth, it's not very pretty. I mean, they say we've been fighting for thousands of years. That's not true. They try to make it more complicated than it is. And what we Palestinians are saying is, look, this is not the first time things like this have happened in history. In fact, in American history, there was a man named Nat Turner. He was a slave. He led a slave rebellion in 1831. And it was ugly. They killed women and children, and it was really terrible. And you might look at that and say, I wish something like that never happened. And we all wish something like that never happened. But you don't look at that and see what he did and say, well, then that means slavery was justified, or slavery was acceptable, or that all black people should pay the price. No, you look at that and you say, what are the conditions that would lead somebody to do something like this? And you try to get to the root of the problem. What happened last Saturday was a symptom of the disease, not the disease itself. The disease is occupation. The disease is depriving people of their basic fundamental rights, of blockading people. And then you end up with things like this. It's sad, but we have to look at why these kinds of things happen. And the only way to get past it is for a just freedom for the Palestinian people everywhere.
As a professor of law, can you explain how Israel can blatantly breach multiple international laws, conventions of human rights? How do you assess that as a professor of law?
Well, I mean, international law is only as good as, however the most powerful countries in the world will enforce it. And Israel has been protected by the United States at every turn. The United States, which is another major breaker of international law. I mean, they dropped white phosphorus this week. We know that's a violation of international law. Bombing people in their homes is a violation of international law. You know, just because you think you might get one leader doesn't mean you're allowed to kill the whole family. That's not the way international law works. So Israel is constantly violating international law, and not just in the past week. I mean, just all their policies of apartheid. But international law is not divorced from politics. It's only going to be as effective as the most powerful countries in the world let it be. And America has always protected Israel at every turn. And this protection of Israel has made it so that we can never really get to a just peace. And so these kinds of things are going to keep happening. It's a lack of courage. It's a lack of moral clarity. It's a lack of understanding what the future is going to hold. So international law is important, but it's not divorced from politics.
How much has President Biden's response, albeit publicly, been about playing into a domestic audience as well as an international one?
All of the support of Israel in America is a domestic political issue. It has nothing to do with sort of the strategic goals of America throughout the world. It has not. Israel is a strategic problem for America in the Arab world and throughout the world. It's all about the power of the Israeli lobby in America. If you don't fully get behind Israel, they won't support you, and that could mean massive attacks against you and loss of money. We see it all the time. We've seen it from congressmen as far back as Paul Findley and David Bonnier and Cynthia McKinney, to all the way up to Bernie Sanders recently, who, as a Jewish American, criticized Israel, not even in the strongest terms, and was viciously attacked by the pro-Israel lobbies. So it's really it's all about domestic politics. It's not about international politics at all. It's all about domestic politics and getting elected again. And what we're going to see probably I'm very saddened by it and frustrated, but we're going to see Biden and Trump now jumping over themselves, jumping over each other to see who can love Israel more in the upcoming election. And that's not good for Americans, and it's definitely not going to be good for Palestinians.
Indeed. Well, we appreciate your insights. Aljazeera, a professor of law and activist. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.
Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, continues his tour of the Middle East. He hopes to prevent the Gaza conflict from spilling into a bigger war. He's now in the United Arab Emirates after visiting Saudi Arabia. He discussed the situation in Gaza with Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud. Bin Farhan has condemned the attacks on civilians and called for a de-escalation.
We need to find a way to quickly de-escalate the situation, to quickly bring back peace, at least stopping the guns, and then working towards addressing also the humanitarian challenges. And here I have to emphasize that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is very, very difficult, and we need to work together to make sure that access for humanitarian relief and humanitarian goods is allowed. This is something that is critical and is, of course, enshrined in international humanitarian law.
As Israel pursues its legitimate right to defending its people and to trying to assure that this never happens again, it is vitally important that all of us look out for civilians. And we're working together to do exactly that. In particular, working on establishing safe areas in Gaza, working on establishing corridors so that humanitarian assistance can reach people who need it. None of us want to see suffering by civilians on any side, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's anywhere else.
The US says it's working with Egypt, Israel and Qatar to open the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt. Let's go live now to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, what can you tell us about Washington's efforts to get its citizens out of Gaza?
Yeah, we've been working the phones for several hours trying to determine whether or not that negotiated opening of that Rafah crossing, we had understood that it would be open from 12 until 5 local time to allow roughly 600 Palestinian Americans to escape to the Egypt side of that crossing. But the latest information we've been able to piece together is that it never opened. We've reached out to the State Department multiple times. The State Department has not provided us updated information, but our sources on the ground tell us that the crossing never opened. Now, from what we can determine, the Egypt side did open, but Israel, we understand, did not live up to their side of the agreement and did not open their side of the border on the Gaza side. And so what happened was not only were Palestinian Americans not allowed to evacuate, but the Egyptian side, which had humanitarian aid waiting to come into Gaza, it also was prevented from entering Gaza. So, as you heard there, the Saudi foreign minister reminding the Secretary of State of the United States that the priority is humanitarian aid under international law. But it appears, despite the United States and Israel saying they are adhering to international law, which would allow for civilians to be protected under international law, they didn't get the humanitarian aid. They also didn't get their evacuations as promised.
And Kimberly, there's also movement of US embassy personnel out of Israel. What should we make of that?
What we should make of it is that the priority for the United States and Israel is getting American citizens out of Israel. But when it comes to an American citizen who is trapped in Gaza and of Palestinian descent, that apparently isn't the priority, because what we know is that for at least 48, maybe even 72 hours now, there have been charter flights for non-emergency U.S. Embassy staff and government staff. And we also know that if you're an American citizen who was unable to obtain a commercial flight, you are being given a charter flight out of Israel if you want it. And those will continue for the foreseeable future. But if you're in Gaza, well, you had 5 hours to get out, and then it turns out that the crossing didn't even open. So there does appear to be a stark contrast there. And we should also give you some updated numbers that we did get from the U.S. State Department in terms of the numbers of Americans that are now confirmed to be dead as of last Saturday's attack inside Israel. We do know now that there are 29 Americans killed from that attack by Hamas inside Israel, 15 missing. So those are the latest numbers. According to the U.S. State Department, they were happy to provide that information. But apparently, when it comes to trying to find out information regarding the evacuations out of Gaza, there was no information at all.
OK, thanks so much. We have to leave it there. Kimberly Halkett, our White House correspondent. Israeli forces have ramped up raids across the occupied West Bank, arresting more than 40 Palestinians in different cities. Around 400 Palestinians have been detained since the beginning of this major escalation between Hamas and Israel. Israeli forces have killed at least 55 Palestinians in the West Bank since last Saturday, as Nida Ibrahim explains.
Much of the occupied West Bank has been locked down by Israeli forces in the week since Hamas launched its military operation. Palestinians have largely been confined to their homes, and by early Saturday, dozens had been arrested. Most in Hebron, in the south of the occupied West Bank, many of them members of Hamas. In Jericho, one Palestinian was killed while taking part in confrontations with Israeli forces near the Aqba al-Jabr refugee camp.
Our children are not different from their fellow Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip. Let's consider ourselves there. It's all for the sake of the homeland.
With around 400 prisoners arrested since the start of the escalation, Palestinian families say they're worried about their children in Israeli jails. A father told Aljazeera that his 17-year-old son was beaten before being arrested.
They attacked him brutally. He's just a child, and they were very violent with him. Someone called us first saying he's dead, but then we were told he's in prison alive. It's worrying.
In the Jenin refugee camp, one of the shortest Israeli raids there concluded without casualties. Israeli forces arrested at least 2 Palestinians, but before the army retreated, armed groups fought back.
Israeli forces have raided the Qalandia refugee camp and arrested Palestinians at a time when the occupied West Bank is under an Israeli blockade. It's almost impossible for people to move from one city to another. Those who try can get killed.
Israeli forces killed a Palestinian and wounded 4 others near Tulkarem in the north of the West Bank late on Friday. Witnesses say their only fault was driving on the street. Palestinians continue to bid farewell to those killed during protests, with around 300 people injured during the demonstrations, a large number of them by live ammunition. This outpouring of grief is only expected to increase. Nida Ibrahim, Aljazeera, the occupied West Bank.
Let's go to Aljazeera's Imran Khan, who's also in the occupied West Bank in Ramallah. Imran, what's happening on the ground in terms of protests where you are?
Well, the protests are ongoing. They've been happening every day since Saturday. It happened 3 or 4 times a day rather. But today they were focused against the German representative's office in Ramallah. The Germans have thrown their weight behind Israel, backing Israel's right to defend itself. That's angered many Palestinians who were at the German representative's office, and they were telling us that my enemy just isn't the person who's shooting at me. It's the person that's actually helping the person shoot at me. The Germans didn't release any statements about the protests. Indeed, there was nothing coming out from any of the international community about any of these protests. But there is a lot of anger on the streets here. Remember, Ramallah and the occupied West Bank is actually still under blockade. If you're Palestinian, you can't get out of the occupied West Bank. But more than that, you can't actually move between various different Palestinian areas. The Israelis simply won't let you leave. So that means that somewhere like Ramallah, which normally on the weekend would be packed with people coming in from various different Palestinian areas to do their shopping and hang out with their friends, etc., that's not happening. So there's a very much a feeling of a very nervous atmosphere in Ramallah, across the occupied West Bank. Quite simply, people are staying at home, they're watching the television, they're looking at those pictures coming out of Gaza, and they are actually wondering if the occupied West Bank might be next.
And Imran, we've learnt the US President Joe Biden has spoken to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. What was said between the two leaders?
Well, Joe Biden actually made that phone call to Mahmoud Abbas, and what came out of it is what we've seen coming out between the Palestinians and the Americans in the last few days. There was no difference in the type of language being used that was used by the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas with Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, just a few days ago. He reiterated that the only solution to peace was a two-state solution, that the Palestinians had a legitimate right to self-determination, that they needed to open up a humanitarian corridor, and he condemned Israel's actions. President Joe Biden listened to all of that, but by no means was this a breakthrough. And that means that there is a stalemate. But it's the only avenue the Palestinian president, the Palestinian Authority have. The only way they can actually put any pressure is through the international community, because they don't have any relations with Hamas and they have very little relationship with the Israelis. And the Israelis are actually in no mood to listen to the Palestinian Authority. So it is more of the same, but if you're hoping for a breakthrough, that simply didn't come.
Thanks for bringing us up to speed. As always, Imran Khan in Ramallah, the occupied West Bank. Stay with us here on Al Jazeera as we continue our special coverage, including going hungry in Gaza. Israel's total blockade and airstrikes mean supplies are running low. And the conflict has triggered thousands of people to take to the streets in many parts of the world. We'll have those details next.